What is up, crew? How's it going tonight, guys? Anyway, stoked to be doing this live stream. So tonight I'm actually going to be doing something that I've wanted to do for a very long time. And I'm going to be working through two very, very significant lectures that pertain to what is known as the Malines Conversation Group, which is really kind of official adjacent Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue group that has put out some great work on the question of Anglican Holy Orders. Now, when I say it's kind of official adjacent, this particular group, the Malines Conversation Group, is actually supported by the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Archbishop of York, so from the Church of England, basically. And then on the Roman Catholic side, figures like Cardinal Kurt Koch, who's the current prefect for the dicastery for the promotion of Christian unity, has supported it. The main representative from the Vatican for Anglican relations has supported it. So it's a very significant, serious, and weighty dialogue group. Now, this dialogue group, which actually put out this document, which these lectures I'm going to reflect on actually go over, they are what am I trying to say? Sorry. This dialogue group actually goes back about 100 years in time. It's called, again, the Malines Conversation Groups. Many people are unaware of it. But it goes back in time to around the 1920s, and it was originally started, it's called the Malines Conversation Group because it was originally started between I believe the Archbishop of Brussels, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Brussels in Belgium, Malines, Brussels, and then also dialoguing with a high-level lay member from the Church of England, from the Anglo-Catholic wing of the Church of England. Anyways, they had dialogues kind of reflecting on, okay, after Apostolicae Curiae and Sapiens Officio, where do we go forward from here? They talked for a while, then those conversations went defunct, but in the modern world, they've been picked up once again, and very serious figures have been sent from each side of the church to dialogue about kind of what do we do when it comes to this question of Anglican Holy Orders? What are ways we can move forward that's not just peddling the old same arguments kind of back and forth? And one thing they'll talk about in these lectures that I'm going to reflect on tonight is they'll talk about, as important as this work is, it's been thoroughly looked at by many, many figures. So they'll note like Dom Gregory Dix and other people who have defended basically Anglican Holy Orders on the grounds of Apostolicae Curiae and Sapiens Officio. Of course, a lot of Roman Catholics have responded in kind. But this particular document that I want to look at tonight, which is, again, I didn't note this before, but it's titled Sorores and Spe, and it was put out by this group, the Malines Conversation Group, in, I believe it's the year 2021. So it's only like 5 years old. This document focuses more so on the liturgy, eschatology, and then it uses examples like the Assyrian Church of the East to talk about how Anglicanism and Roman Catholicism can potentially move forward when it comes to some of these questions. So what I want to do tonight, when I said I'm going to be reflecting on lectures, so there's an ecumenical I don't even know what to call it, basically center called the Centro Pro Unione, and I might be pronouncing that wrong. That is like this dialogue I'm going to show. The people who are like hosting the dialogue and involved with running it are some of the top people in the Vatican when it comes to the question of ecumenism. So, for example, the woman who will kind of introduce the speakers, she's actually on the official study group number 10 team from the Synod and Synodality in Rome. Like these are they're very significant and weighty people. They're also very involved with the Angelicum in Rome. And this lecture I want to look at, the two people who are going to talk, the first one is going to be the canon theologian from Westminster Abbey, whose name is the Reverend Canon Dr. Jamie Hockey. He's a great representative. And so I don't necessarily, he's a great representative from the Anglican position. He will note at one point he sees women's holy orders differently than I do. This document even does talk about women's holy orders a bit as well. But I still think he's an amazing man of God and somebody who really I'm not worthy to untie the shoes of his sandals. So he's going to speak. And then the second person, so obviously he's coming from the Anglican side. Then coming from the Roman Catholic side, there's going to be a speaker who is actually the liturgical chair at the Leuven University in Belgium. So, which is, if you know anything, I believe it's the oldest Roman Catholic university in Europe. Pope Francis actually visited there a couple of years ago. Anyways, so the second man, his name is Joris Geldhof, and he's the liturgical chair at the Louvain University. Both of these men were a part of the Malines Conversation Group, the modern rendition of it that put forward this document, Sorores in Spe, which they're going to talk about. And basically in this document, they're each going to be talking about from their own angle and from their participation within this group, where they see Anglicanism and Roman Catholicism moving forward with one another when it comes to the questions of holy orders. And again, they're going to talk a lot about eschatology, which is something I talk a lot about on this channel. They're going to talk a lot about the liturgy, and they're going to talk about some various other things that this touched on. Again, one thing they'll touch on is this is big, but the anaphora of the Assyrian Church of the East, and why Rome has accepted that, even though it does not contain the traditional ex opere words that are necessitated in the Western Church, including in Anglicanism, to bring about a substantial change in the sacrament. So they'll talk about why did they accept the Assyrian Church of the East anaphora, even though it doesn't contain the language that in the Western Church we see as pertinent and requisite for substantial change within the sacrament. And so this is going to be a very deep dive kind of video, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do it similar to how I did the last sermon that I did on a live stream earlier this week. I'm going to play parts of it, stop, and then reflect on it, and then we'll move forward from there. So I think this will be really edifying. So with that said, guys, I'm going to go ahead and hop straight into this. Again, the first person talking is going to be the Reverend Canon Dr. Jamie Hockey, who's one of my favorite figures in the Anglican world, extremely learned, extremely just well-spoken, and I'm excited for you guys to get to see this. This is something that, again, these like actual serious dialogues, what's fascinating is you look at these YouTube videos and they have like 100 some views, and I'm like, this is better than most of the stuff out there you'll see online with 10,000 views. But anyway, so I'll go ahead and play this, guys, and then again I'll stop it at various points and yeah, give dialogue and we'll move forward from there. Okay, so hold on, actually give me a second, let me do this again. Okay, give me 1 second, guys. All right, share screen. I'm such a neophyte when it comes to sharing these things, guys. All right, cool. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and play this, and then we'll move forward from there. If you have any trouble hearing this, guys, please do let me know. Yeah, please do let me know. Okay. By the way, the full link to this is in the description of this video. Oh no. Sorry, guys. All right. I'm so sorry, guys. This is my wife's computer and she gets phone calls on here. Okay. Real life interruptions. All right, cool. If you guys have any trouble hearing it, let me know, please. Or if it's too loud, let me know as well.
Good morning, buongiorno to all of you. We start right away with a presentation of the document Sorores in Spe.
This is such a big boy presentation, you guys. I'm going to be real with you.
In good ecumenical circles and Anglican and Catholic perspective. So we start with the Anglican perspective with the Right Reverend Dr. Jamie Hockey, who is canon theologian at Westminster Abbey, chair of the Westminster Abbey Institute, and visiting professor at King's College in London. He's also by fellow of the Clare College in Cambridge University, where he's also been teacher and dean of the studies. His expertise is ecumenism and ecclesiology. He has been also member of the Reformed Anglican International Official Theological Dialogue. He has a very long list of commitments and roles he has been in charge of. I will just mention the one that is closest to us. He's governor of the Anglican Center in Rome, as he is a chaplain to Her Majesty the Queen. Please.
Yeah, this man's also he was the chaplain to Queen Elizabeth II. I believe he's the chaplain for King Charles III.
And of course, he's a member of the steering committee of the Malines Conversation Group. Please.
Well, thanks to
this man's
Sorores for that very warm and generous
Abbey
introduction,
right now.
and to Father Jim for his welcome. As Jim alluded in his introduction, it is, of course, with such sorrow and anxiety that Mariana Hnip, one of our own members, cannot be with us today because of the war in Ukraine. And it might be judged a luxury that we are here discussing a topic such as Anglican orders when our brothers and sisters are under bombardment in Ukraine. So just before I begin, I wanted, if I may, to read a paragraph from the latest joint statement of the International Reformed Anglican Dialogue, which was on koinonia, on communion. Because, of course, war is one of the worst possible breaches of koinonia, one of the...
Just one thing I'll note, you'll hear this word used a lot, koinonia. It's a Greek word pointing to communion. But this theology that they're going to present here, again, both, and for those just joining us, this is the Reverend Dr. Jamie Hockey. He's the canon theologian at Westminster Abbey. And the second lecturer, who I'm also going to go over tonight, is Joris Geldhof. He's a Roman Catholic, and he's the liturgical chair at the Leuven University in Belgium. And they're both reflecting on the new document, which I riff about a lot on my channel, Sorores and Spe, which is a document calling for a Roman Catholic recognition of Anglican Holy Orders from both sides of this study group. And this is, it's not an official group in the same way ARCIC is, but it's official adjacent because there are many, many big-time supporters of this group, such as the Archbishops of Canterbury and York. And then from the Roman Catholic side, it's been spoken of, like it's celebrated in many ways by Cardinal Kurt Koch, who's the current prefect for the dicastery for the promotion of Christian unity. And like the woman who just introduced him, she's on the study group number 10, which from the Synod and Synodality in Rome, which is the study group on ecumenism. So they're very high level figures. These people are also oftentimes involved with the Angelicum in Rome. So this is a very these are both very serious people. But you'll hear it's a koinonia theology. It's a theology of communion that has a lot to do with eschatology and liturgy. And then also, as I said earlier, they'll reflect on things like Roman Catholic movements with the Assyrian Church of the East and how that actually pertains to this question. They'll talk a little bit about some of their reflections coming back from Apostolicae Curiae and Sapiens Officio. But as he'll note in this particular lecture that he's about to give, that's not the main driving point behind this this document. They note that great work has been done elsewhere there, such as by Dom Gregory Dix, but then they're focusing on a new angle of the question. Okay, anyways, I'll get back to this.
Worst possible disruption of the oppressed. To receive the gift of koinonia prompts proclamation in life and words of the love, hospitality, reconciliation, and justice that characterize the triune God, as the Church is sent out without reserve to share in God's mission of reconciliation, which extends to all people and all of creation.
If there's any trouble hearing it all, guys, please let me know in the comments.
Let it be so. So to Sorores in Spe. Much has been written on Leo XIII's bull, Apostolicae Curiae, and the responses to it. The responses began, of course, with a lengthy letter from the Archbishops of Canterbury and York entitled Sapiens Officio, in which the archbishops painstakingly responded in detail to the negative judgment on the question of Anglican orders, whilst also introducing their own critique of the document's theological method. Quote, "In overthrowing our orders, the archbishops wrote, he, the Pope, overthrows all his own and pronounces sentence on his own church." End of quote. Since then, most scholarly engagement with this text and its judgment has focused on addressing historical inaccuracies and inadequacies, has focused on questions relating to form and intention. And since Unitatis Redintegratio and the emerging ARCIC process, a thoroughly changed context in which Catholics and Anglicans have rediscovered an intimate family likeness and developed a rapprochement of theology and practice. The document, Sorores in Spe, does not directly address questions of historicity or historical context, which have been explored in much detail elsewhere. For example, in the Anglican Benedictine Dom Gregory Dix's The Question of Anglican Orders, and more recently in Bill Franklin's centenary volume of essays published in 1996. However, the Malines Group's work on this subject certainly has engaged with these broader issues, not least during its 2015 meeting in Boston, with papers on the sacramentality of the Church, the role of memory and tradition, the Catholic faith and apostolic succession, and indeed the reception and heritage of Apostolicae Curae. My own paper on that occasion argued that the Anglican Ordinal, judged as defective by Pope Leo in terms of form, should be seen as but one voice amongst many within a broader humanist conversation about rites and orders prior to and during the Reformation and Counter-Reformation periods. For example, no less an authority than St. John Fisher believed that the imposition of hands alone, and not the correction of the instruments, was the essential form of the sacrament of order. A deeper study of history may yet still help us with this topic.
Okay, so I'm just going to pause it here. So what he's saying here, and welcome everybody who's joining in with us now. So what he's saying here is the primary impetus and the focus, the driving reality behind this paper that he's going to go over, which again is a paper put out by this official adjacent study group called the Malines Conversations Group. The main driving force behind this is actually, he's going to go on to talk about why it's actually liturgical and eschatological in nature. But at the beginning here, what he's noting is this doesn't negate the importance of these historical questions. So for those just who may not be, who may not have some of the background kind of nuances of these particular questions, by historical, we mean the traditional scholastic categories that a valid sacrament requires the proper form, minister, matter, and intention. And so Apostolicae Curae is all about both intention and form. And so it's asking, during the time of King Edward VI, was the change that was brought about in the prayer book, did that by necessity negate the sacerdotal belief of Anglicans that when we were ordaining priests, continuing the sacrament of Holy Orders, did we believe that we were continuing a sacerdotal priesthood? And this is what he's talking about. The historical questions, Anglicans, for example, have always argued back. So Sapius Officio, which is the official response of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Archbishop of York from the year 1897, I believe, or 1898. I think it's 1897. Their official response argues we absolutely have always believed in a sacerdotal priesthood at our core. And it also argues that the ex opere words that are used are to be interpreted by the rest of the actual liturgical rite. And the rest of the liturgical rite does speak of continuing the office of the presbyter and of the priest in the way that it had always been done in England. So people like Dom Gregory Dix and whatnot will argue, as I think is valid as well, that we have maintained a sacerdotal priesthood. And there are even some other things which I'll reflect on here shortly. That's not tonight, but another time soon. Like there's a 1990 study paper put out by the United States Council of Catholic Bishops, which does say ipso facto, like Apostolicae Curae is not an infallible statement. Pope Francis has explicitly said this as well, by the way, for those who are interested. Pope Francis has said this in an official dubia response that he gave not that long ago. It was on women deacons, but basically what's interesting is he related that conversation with Anglican Holy Orders and explicitly said this is not an infallible statement, but it's open for study. So you have to understand, in the Roman mind, it's not infallible or not important at all. There's middle categories. One of them is called definitive. And even the word definitive, it's kind of being, over time, that what that actually means is kind of being reflected upon. So something can be definitive, but not necessarily ipso facto infallible in the Roman Catholic system. So we need to understand that first off. But so again, they're reflecting on this notion here, So right there, he's talking about that these questions of historicity are important because most dialogues about Anglican Holy Orders go back in time to the historical questions, which are really important. And so that's what he was just saying. There's been a lot of great work done on that over the years. It's not that those are not important. He just talked about a paper he just put out where St. John Fisher believed that only the imposition of hands was needed for to continue the lineage of apostolic succession. So there are absolutely historical questions that can be helpful. And this is what, like that 1990 paper from the USCCB, in a sense, it's reflecting on is there a possibility that maybe Rome could eventually say, like, apostolic curiae is in effect if Anglicans didn't believe in a sacerdotal priesthood. But if that history can be re-reflected on, maybe there's a way that can be revisited. So, and that would be an argument that I would make and call for, is that yes, a sacerdotal priesthood is needed. We just believe that proper understanding of our historicity shows the notion of a sacerdotal priesthood within Anglicanism. However, all that aside, and that is important, what this, the rest of this lecture is going to be about is it's about other important theological considerations to take into account. And this is something people also don't regularly think on, but this really is about eschatology. And what he's going to talk a lot about, and certainly then the next lecturer, the Roman Catholic chair of the liturgical studies in the Louvain University, is going to talk about how eschatology matters. And I know that sounds, learned and nice to say eschatology, but what it actually means is something I riff about a lot on my channel, which is liturgy is not just like a pretty thing on the side. Liturgy actually dictates what our theology is. And so since Vatican II, since the Novus Ordo and the Anglican liturgies have moved together, what this speaks of is it speaks of an eschatological oneness that comes present in that is drawn into the present. And then since they're basically synonymous, it's saying if we believe we'll be united in the eschaton, that should then dictate how we also interrelate with communion now. And so it has to do with the liturgical oneness of the Mass and how that liturgical oneness comes into the present. And again, this will even get into a little bit some of the reflections on the Assyrian Church of the East and their anaphora and how that's recently been accepted by Rome and why that matters when it comes to Anglicanism. So yeah, I think this is really interesting. Oh, and thank you, brother. Appreciate this. Yeah, if you guys feel so moved, a like certainly does help. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and keep playing this. This guy's an absolute boss. Again, so this is Dr. Jamie Hockey. He is the current canon theologian at Westminster Abbey in London, and he's one of my favorite Anglicans on the planet. So I'm going to go ahead and keep playing this. And then the second lecture will again be from the Roman Catholic side from the Louvain University.
But Sorores in Spe emerges from the entirely new context in which Catholics and Anglicans now find themselves. To quote the final report of Archic 1, the new context, formally endorsed by Cardinal Willebrands in 1985. The Malines Conversations Group has been working since 2013 on the relationship between the reality of life and the truth of faith. Why is it that what we have come to say about one another theologically is so frequently not represented in practice? Sorores in Spe represents a kind of harvesting of the extraordinary levels of agreement represented by the Archic process and the profound insights of the liturgical and ecumenical movements in the 20th centuries which our churches share. The title of the document, Sorores in Spe, comes from an inscription on the joint tomb of two English queens buried in Westminster Abbey. The half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, both daughters of Henry VIII, lived and reigned during some of the most turbulent years of the 16th century. Mary is well known as a deeply pious Catholic monarch, whilst Elizabeth is often described as England's first Anglican queen. Despite the personal, political, and religious animosity which characterized their relationship, they were eventually buried in the same tomb on the instruction of King James I, Elizabeth's successor as monarch. James had more than a passing interest in the reunion of Christendom, and as if to explain the implicit symbolism in their joint burial, he commissioned an inscription in Latin on the base of the monument, which reads, in translation, "Partners in throne and grave, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in the hope of the resurrection."
I just want to point out, do you like, I want to just give this the weight it deserves. The weight of that is so meaningful. I mean, I realize that theology is something that obviously is done in the mind and is done by theologians. There's also a real weight to symbolism and to sign. And the fact that Mary Tudor, which is the one who was the one who tried to restore England back to Roman Catholicism after the time of King Henry VIII, that she is buried in the exact same tomb as Queen Elizabeth I, and that on the bottom of their tomb is written "Sisters in Hope of the Resurrection." That's an extremely weighty and serious reality. And again, this man is actually the canon theologian at the cathedral, at the abbey where they're actually buried. So I just want to throw that out there. It's very profound. And you can see that today if you go to Westminster Abbey. All right, I'll go ahead and continue.
The drafters of this document and the Malines Conversations Group members decided that an allusion to this joint burial could be very helpful. St. Paul VI, in his sermon at the canonization of the 40 English Masters in 1970, spoke hopefully of the day when the Catholic Church would be able to embrace her ever-beloved sister in the one authentic communion of the family of Christ. Our two churches, with their common roots and a substantially shared life of faith and service, still live in hope of the resurrection, a genuinely united ministry through, with, and in Christ, caput et corpus, alongside one another. Sorores in Spe explores how this relates to the question of Anglican orders in 4 sections. Whilst it's a deeply theological document, it's not written to be appreciated by professional theologians alone. The first section offers a short history of Anglican-Catholic relations from 1896 onwards, beginning with the process which culminated in Apostolicae Curae and Cepus Officio, a section on the Malines Conversations, including Dom Lambert Baudouin's famous essay, L'Église Anglicane unie non absorbée. It moves to discuss the achievements of Archic and Iarchum, and finally celebrates an ecclesiology of symbols. Since Pope St. Paul VI famously gave his...
I just want to talk real quick for 1 second. So Archic is the Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, which I talk about all the time on my channel. Iarchum, I'm not even sure exactly what it means, but Iarchum is basically the official wing between, it's the other official body that's shared between the Roman Catholic Church and the Anglican Communion, which is basically based around walking together in the way. It's about the two communions going on pilgrimage, and that through that the prayer is that some of the old boundary and old fighting lines would be left behind. So, for example, Iarchum is the group that Pope Francis and Archbishop Justin Welby, when they stood side by side in the Vatican commissioning pairs, I don't know if people even know this, they commissioned with their croziers in hand, side by side blessing one another. They blessed Anglican and Roman Catholic bishops who were from the same areas around the world. They'd commissioned the two pairs to go back to their local community to be a bridge for ecumenism and to do the work of the gospel together side by side. So that's Iarchum that does that type of work. So I just want to say that. Now he's going to talk here about signs or the symbols, which I talk about a lot, such as Archbishop Arthur Michael Ramsey, who's one of my major theological heroes, being given an episcopal ring by Pope St. Paul VI. And by the way, this same episcopal ring is passed down in Lambeth Palace to all the archbishops of Canterbury. So like when Justin Welby, and again, I don't want to turn this into women's ordination, God's peace to her. I believe in Malines Holy Orders, but I also believe in respect for female clerics. But Sarah Mullally, Bishop Sarah Mullally, she also wore this episcopal ring when she went to visit Pope Leo XIV. So it's really beautiful that ring is passed down.
And Cepus Officio, a section on the Malines Conversations, including Dom Lambert Baudouin's famous essay, L'Église Anglicane unie non absorbée.
Sorry guys, I went back a little bit.
To discuss the achievements of Archic and Iarchum, and finally celebrates an ecclesiology of symbols. Since Pope St. Paul VI famously gave his episcopal ring to Archbishop Michael Ramsey in 1966, prior to the first meetings of Archic, pectoral crosses, stoles, rings, most recently a crozier head, have been presented as gifts by popes to Anglican clergy. Frequently underplayed in formal reflection, this narrative offers a mutually illuminating counterpoint.
Two other things I would point out. This is not just Pope Francis and Pope Leo that do this. Pope Benedict XVI had Archbishop Rowan Williams. He actually came and gave the homily, I believe, during a mass at one of the churches in Rome. So if you know about the Roman Catholic system, you only can give the homily if you're a priest. So St. Pope John Paul II gave his stole to, he gave a stole, excuse me, not his stole, but he gave a stole to Henry Chadwick, who is the Anglican leader of Archic 1, on the one on the Holy Eucharist. and he's one of the most beloved figures in Anglicanism. So this goes back a long time. And you give stoles to priests, of course. So this symbol of signs goes way back, or this communion of symbol and signs goes back many pontiffs.
To the formal theological dialogue, which, in the words of our document, quote, reveals a different, deeper reality about mutual recognition, which extends beyond the brusque negative judgment of ordination rites in 1896, end quote. The first section closes with a question which is really formational for the rest of the document. Quote, can statements which were made about one another's life and identity prior to the rediscovery of such a deep and shared sense of identity and mission still be deployed as if such growth in mutual recognition, both explicit and implicit, had not taken place? End quote. Our second section is a journey into the hermeneutics of tradition and salvation. My friend and colleague, Professor Keltoff, will say much more about the methodology of this section in his presentation. But in many ways, this is the engine room of the whole document. Harvesting the insights of the ecumenical and liturgical movements with a substantial series of reflections on the Second Vatican Council, Sorores in Spe argues that these developments, faithful to the tradition, provide a hermeneutical key for understanding the depth of the new and shared context in which Anglicans and Catholics now know each other. La Nouvelle Théologie and the wider ressourcement currents in the early to mid-20th century themselves offered a new kind of language which found a ready home in the archic process and offers a richer and broader lens through which to consider questions including apostolic succession, the foundational nature of baptism, and the topic of priesthood. Our document argues that the topic of ordination should best be analyzed through a soteriological lens, rather than relying on one or other more reductive epistemologies. This, we suggest, is a faithful reading of the challenges and opportunities laid down in the documents of Vatican II. The third section of Sorores in Spe addresses the essentials of church, Eucharist, and ministries. Note the order here. There is an implicit suggestion that church precedes ministry, and that ministry can only be understood within a wider ecclesiological landscape. This section explores the lex orandi of both our communions. Catholics and Anglicans have experienced substantial liturgical reform since 1896, and the Anglican rites of ordination, note rites plural because each member church of the communion has its own rite, have undergone their own renaissance in the spirit of both the liturgical and ecumenical movements. Indeed, prior to the publication of the Common Worship Ordinal in my own Church of England, the chairman of the Liturgical Commission sought the views and advice of Catholic liturgical scholars teaching in Rome.
So just real quick, guys. So this is what he's talking about here is what I was did. So he's saying that liturgy has converged since the time of Vatican II, and that Anglicans, when reflecting on how our liturgy would look, actually sought the advice of Roman Catholic liturgical scholars. Okay, that's what he's talking about here. That it actually there's a mutual there's a real reflection from one another that's occurred. So the ecumenism sought, even though sometimes we feel like it hasn't gone very far, actually an enormous amount has occurred. We're just oftentimes unaware of it. Okay, really quickly, guys, I do have to step out. I'm going to play this. I have to step out and grab the charger for this computer really quickly, but I will go ahead and play this and I'll be back very promptly.
There is now a close correlation between Anglican and Catholic rites, the inner logic of which can be sensed in the consensus expressed in the joint statements of Archic on ministry, ordination, and Eucharist. But perhaps even more importantly, when seen within the context of the preceding section, Sorores in Spe pointedly concludes that when there is such a shared pattern of liturgy, Eucharist, and devotion in ordination rites, quote, one must conclude that there is such a density of sacramental grace that a narrow focus on the question as to whether the form and formula of the ordination rite are precisely correct can actually obscure the mystical reality of what is taking place, end quote. This refers, in the words of St. Thomas Aquinas, to that which is the enunciated reality itself, rather than that which is simply enunciated about it. Throughout the Malines Group's discussion of these questions, and indeed throughout the document, there has been an insistence that the lived experience of Christian sacramental life must be one criterion by which we judge contested questions. Now, importantly, this section does not ignore the reality of the ordination of women as deacons, priests, and bishops in many parts of the Anglican Communion. Anglicans are painfully aware of the language of new obstacle, as articulated by the official Vatican spokesman in 1994. But Anglicans also hope that Catholics appreciate our language of reception and the theological seriousness with which many Anglican provinces have approached this question. But Sorores in Spe articulates how the specific historic and contemporary injustice on orders in general terms.
So again, just to note, and this is a place I would disagree, that I am a male-only Holy Orders guy. Ooh, sorry guys, I'm out of breath. I'm getting old, man. But however, this is still a very important question to reflect on. And it goes to, what are the possibilities for communion, even if this question about Holy Orders is not able to be resolved in the way that we would necessarily like it to be? Is there still possibilities that can occur in the meantime? And again, I say that as one who holds to male-only Holy Orders, but still has respect for various people who hold to different views, such as this wonderful theologian and people like N.T. Wright and whatnot. So, okay, I'll go ahead and keep playing it.
Needs to be addressed before our churches engage on the important topic of ministry and gender. Again, to quote the document, the fact that women can, in most provinces, now be ordained does not itself mean that the Pope's condemnation of 1896 must be applied to the present situation. End quote. In short, it's clear that we need a robust, honest, and theological dialogue about gender in general and how gender and ordained ministry relate in particular. But the introduction of a subsequent further question does not render the primary question invalid.
Okay, so I just have to point this out. This is so important. So, and I'm interested to see if this particular video gets a bunch of comments from different people. Live streams don't usually get as many like after the fact comments, but if it does, if you look at some of my other videos, you get a lot of Roman Catholics still coming in and they'll say something to the degree of, well, what about homosexuality and gender stuff? And what about women's holy orders? And it's so difficult for people like me because I go, well, neither of those do I hold. And there's a wide swath within Anglicanism that hold neither of those either. And it does beg the question, again, I believe that in a very real sense, were it not for women's ordination and the stuff around gender, I think our communions would have already been in full communion probably 30 years ago. I think they were really, really close in the 1980s. And I think it would have occurred without those two things. Now, obviously, I can't say that 100%, but that's what I genuinely and deeply believe. So if that is the case, then that's what needs to be dealt with, because later developments don't mean that the older question coming out of Apostolic Curae cannot be dealt with. We could deal with that. They could potentially say, hey, this line is valid, but then it begs the question of what's happened to the line since then. But again, it at least opens the possibility. Then people like within my situation, we could say, okay, because we have male-only bishops going down the line and male-only priests, then that would be valid. Just like they would view the Greek Orthodox, right? From the Roman Catholic perspective. We obviously believe that they are valid. When I'm saying from the Roman Catholic perspective, they could say that. And then when it comes to female ordination, they could say, okay, then what do we do here? Potentially we can call it real ministry, but say that we can't call them valid in the same way that the male orders are. But regardless, the point is that later developments don't necessitate that the earlier question must stand if that would have been worked through without the later developments. That's the point. And just real quick, I'll play this from Quay. There is a diversity, although I would say, yeah, I mean, and I realize this, and certainly this is true, I'd say, in certain sectors in leadership for sure. I do think that Quay, I would say, in my opinion, now where it will go in the next 50 years, it's hard to say. Obviously, there's entire bishops' conferences like the German bishops, for example, that are more pro, at least certainly women deacons. I would say though, I saw both in Francis and Pope Leo, fairly strong emphasis on Balthazar's notion of the Petrine principle versus the Marian principle. So there is a wide swath within certain parts of Roman Catholicism. I do still think though, in my view, it seems the hierarchy is still like fairly strong on this point. So we'll see where this goes. But again, I think there's also like, if you look, I think this might have been today or just yesterday, a group of Norwegian Lutherans just did a pilgrimage to Rome, and Pope Leo said some wonderful things about them. You can look it up. If you type in Pope Leo on Google, it'll pop up. But him meeting with Lutherans, and there's men and women there, and he certainly receives them cordially and respectfully. This is the way he received Archbishop Sarah Mullally, even with their differences. And so we'll see kind of how that goes. Again, I still perceive this possibility, and they'll get into this a little bit. They don't say this explicitly, but this possibility of could it be said from the Roman Catholic viewpoint that the line is valid, but then have some sort of a differentiation between the male and the female orders that still like honors good things about the female orders and honors some form of ministry, but then still speaks of a strictly sacramental validity through the male orders. That's the kind of the way I perceive it possibly happening in the future. But we'll see. Yeah, we'll see. And I if you're saying here, Quay, on kind of what I was just reflecting on, we'll see what happens, man. I think a lot of big things will come down the pipeline in the next few years. Yeah. I appreciate that, Quay. I think, Quay, you're such a legend. Quay and I should do a whole stream, just the two of us, talking about how much agreement there is. Quay, I'm excited for you to, if I know you said you're hopping in and out, but especially when we get to Joris Geldhof, who's the Roman Catholic person reflecting here, what he says is really interesting. He's super pro ecumenism, but he's also a very serious Roman Catholic scholar. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say about Joris Geldhof, who'll come up next. Plus, he has great hair, so he's amazing hair. So, all right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and keep playing this.
Apostolicae Curae operates on its own ground, and it is that ground that Sorores in Spe seeks to question. We have grown together in a way which makes the judgment of 1896 untenable on theological and historical grounds, but also in the lived reality of ecclesial and sacramental life. From an Anglican perspective, the negative judgment of 1896 was deeply problematic on grounds of theology and history, but it also failed to appreciate the reality of what was, by then, nearly 350 years of sacramental ministry in Anglican England. The fourth and final section of Sorores in Spe introduces two examples of ecumenical progress and the healing of history, which would have seemed impossible within the theological worldview of the late 19th century. The joint declaration on the doctrine of justification between the Catholic Church and the Lutheran World Federation is the first of these, illustrating how new insights and a shared language can overcome earlier doctrinal condemnations. The second example is the ecclesial recognition by the Catholic Church.
Give me 1 second, guys, since I don't know if it looks, but in my side, it looks like this is way off. I'm going to try to just reload this video. Let me see what marker I'm at. 17:10. All right, let me go ahead and try to reload this quick, guys, because it'll be so much better if it's not way behind. Sorry, guys. I don't know if my internet is just like low, but I've been having lots of problems lately, but it is what it is. Oh, yikes. Okay, cool. Let me go ahead and fast forward this back to where we were, guys. I'll attempt. I'm so sorry, guys. Give me just a second. Okay. This computer's like a dino. My wife does, although it's so funny, it's not really that
earlier
old.
Doctrinal condemnations. The second example is the ecclesial recognition by the Catholic Church of the Assyrian Church of the East.
This is what I was talking about
and the
earlier.
Subsequent judgment that the anaphora of Adai and Mari, which contains no ad literam institution narrative, should indeed be considered a valid and genuine Eucharistic prayer.
Okay, I'm just going to pause here for a second. So so that the language gets laid out here. So if you're familiar, the Assyrian Church of the East was originally considered like one of the Nestorian churches that came out separate from the rest of the of Catholic Christendom at the time of Chalcedon. So obviously you have the groups that were considered monophysite, although that's been worked through, but the Oriental Orthodox, so the Syrians, the Copts, the Armenians, these types of groups. And then you also have the Assyrian Church of the East. Now, I'm not fully familiar with how the development went about, but what is known as the anaphora is the part during the Eucharistic liturgy that's also called the words of institution. So this is when the priest holds up the host and says, "This is my body, this is my blood," or in the Latin rite, "This is my body, this is the chalice of my blood, the blood of the new and eternal covenant, which is poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." Okay. When the priest does that, that's known as the anaphora. And the theology behind that is that the priest standing in persona Christi is speaking, and out of his speech, like Adam names the animals in day 6 of creation, the priest is speaking, and God brings about new creation on the altar. So the actual change in substance of the elements themselves occurs at the anaphora. That is where the Holy Spirit comes and makes what's in front of us the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ in substance for us. And so in the Assyrian Church of the East, their liturgical rite does not include those words. "This is my body, this is my blood," in that way. And in the Anglican tradition, this is true as well. If you don't say those words, it's not a Eucharist. And in the Roman Catholic Church, obviously that's true. Those are the ex opere operato words, the words that do the work. But in the Assyrian Church of the East, they do not use those words. And yet just recently, the Roman Catholic Church affirmed that from the Roman Catholic Church's perspective, that their Eucharistic rite is in fact a valid rite of the church, and that it does bring about a substantial change in the sacrament. That's what he's talking about here when he says the liturgy of what is it, Adonai and Mari or something. So I'm going to go back just a little bit, but that's what he's talking about. And so he's saying that has relevance, and it also speaks to Thomas Aquinas's reality that there's a reality behind the words that speaks to a deeper reality. And if we were to take the same principle and put it towards Anglican Holy Orders, even though the Edwardine Ordinal during the time between the 1552 prayer book and the 1662 prayer book, even though the words of the ex opere operato were changed, which is what Apostolic Curiae is all about, there's still a deeper intuited sacerdotal reality going on behind it. And that's kind of what it's getting at here, because Apostolic Curiae in the Neo-Thomist movement is focused specifically on the Thomistic categories of the words themselves, the scholastic categories of the words themselves. And this recognition by Rome of the Assyrian Churches of the East liturgical rite speaks to a wider belief in how sacerdotal reality can work. And so they're saying this has implications for a reconsideration of Apostolic Curiae in the Anglican ordinal between that time period, before the Anglicans changed it to be more in line with our actual theology in the 1662 BCP. So that's what he's talking about here. All right, I'm just going to go back like a few seconds so that this is a little bit more coherent. Okay.
In Eucharistic prayer. In this example, the ability to get beyond particular forms of word.
Okay, here we go. Oh boy.
The second example is the ecclesial recognition by the Catholic Church of the Assyrian Church of the East, and the subsequent judgment that the anaphora of Adai and Mari, which contains no ad literam institution narrative, should indeed be considered a valid and genuine Eucharistic prayer. In this example, the ability to get beyond particular forms of words, and therefore to reconcile what had appeared to be a fundamental liturgical anomaly, reveals an extremely flexible application of Catholic theological categories for the sake of the Church's unity. Here, effective sacramental life can be a sign of authentic ecclesiality rather than the other way around.
Listen to this carefully.
It is this effective sacramental life, already partly attested to in that language of grace amongst churches and communities not in full communion with the Holy See, celebrated in Unitatis Redintegratio, which is another basis for the reconsideration of the negative judgment of 1896. The contemporary life of a particular church is fundamental for assessing that church's apostolicity. And it may well be that a re-examination of the tautologous language of ecclesial communities would be a very helpful step along the road. So to round up, as well as the basic conclusion of this document relating to the condemnation of Anglican ordinations and what this text believes to be the unsustainable theological position of 1896, Sorores in Spe also suggests, quote, that the implied judgment that the apostolic succession of the Church of England was lost at the Reformation should be re-examined in the light of contemporary ecclesiological and liturgical understandings of the variety of means by which apostolic succession takes place within authentic traditions of Christian life and worship. The image of walking together, so confidently espoused by Pope Francis and Archbishop Welby, compels us to an honest re-evaluation and celebration of one another's ecclesiality. As long ago as...
Oh, guys, I'm so sorry. Here, let me try this again.
1980, Pope St. John Paul II praised the methodology of archic as one which would scrutinize together the great common treasure, to clothe it in a language at once traditional and expressive of the insights of an age which no longer glories in strife, but seeks to come together in listening to the quiet voice of the Holy Spirit. We are no longer nourished by enmity and controversy, but by a common life of grace in Christ. We suggest that the implications for a fresh consideration of Anglican ministry are profound and transformative. Thank you very much.
All right, guys. What I'm going to do really quickly.
Thank you very much, Professor.
I am going to cut this video out, try to re-upload it so that it's a little bit clearer, and see if my Wi-Fi can handle this, guys. So I'm going to exit this out. Give me 1 second, guys, and I'm going to try to pull this back up. But so I'll try to just riff here while I'm doing this. So again, that is the canon theologian at Westminster Abbey. His name is Dr. Jamie Hockey. He's extremely serious. Quay, if you're still here, I believe you know who Sister Nathalie Beckhart is. She's like the highest ranking woman in the Vatican. He's also done, like, on Westminster Abbey's YouTube page, he's done like tell him that she thinks we can share communion together. And she's actually on the Synod study team for sharing communion together from the Synod and Synodality. This woman who's, again, hosting this dialogue is also in those same circles. Another time here coming up shortly, I'm going to go over the video on the Bishop of Rome document, which was those particular lectures were hosted by the Angelicum in Rome. But my point is, these people are very serious, and you can see, if you're really paying attention, there's a keen difference in how they approach these questions and how people online often approach these questions. And I'm really excited here. I'm going to pull this up for you guys to get to see the second half of this video with Dr. Joris Geldhof, who is, again, he's the Roman Catholic representative. Okay. Okay. We'll see if that's any better. If it's not, guys, I'm just going to have to roll with it. All right. So I'm going to go and share my screen here. Zoinks. If you're ever running a live stream and it cuts out, your Wi-Fi cuts out, it's like, what do I do? All right. So let me add this to the stage. Man, this is moving slow. All right, cool. I'm going to go ahead and keep playing this, guys. Again, check out this guy's hair, man. This guy's hair is off the chain. These people from Belgium are super cool. All right.
Where he's also been teacher and dean of the studies. His expertise is ecumenism and ecclesiology. He has been also member of the Reformed Anglican International Official Theological Dialogue. He has a very long list of commitments and roles he has been in charge of. I will just mention the one that is closest to us. He's governor of the Anglican Center in Rome, as he is a chaplain to Her Majesty the Queen. Please, Dr. Jamie, okay, we look forward to your Anglican vision of the document. Oh. And of course, he's a member of the steering committee of the Malines Conversations Group. Please.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks to Dr. Sorores for that.
Man, this is... Sorry, guys. I'm not sure this computer's going to hold up, but I'm going to try. If it's greeny, I'm just going to roll with it. All right. Yeah, check out this guy's hair. It's off the chain. All right. So here's Dr. Joris Geldhof, the Roman Catholic liturgical chair at the Leuven University in Belgium. He's going to really get into the eschatological reflections
Catholic
here.
Perspective, and we have a wonderful platform of speakers in this study day. So the next speaker giving us the Catholic perspective, always from a member of the Malines Conversations Group, is Dr. Joris Geldhof, who is professor of liturgical studies and sacramental theology at the Catholic University of Leuven, where he also is chair of the Liturgical Institute and chief editor of their official journal, Studies in Liturgy. His field of expertise is very interesting, I would say really challenging, and it's focused on liturgical studies
this is a
and the
beast
Eucharist,
mode presentation that's
in the way they intersect, and I would almost say reaching out contemporary issues. So Christian sacramentality in a post-Christian, post-secularized world. So we look forward to hear your perspective, Dr. Geldhof. You have also published extensively in these areas. Professor Geldhof also has been president of the Societas Liturgica. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My thoughts about the hermeneutical principles which led us when we were drafting Sorores in Spain center around two big clusters. These clusters have to be seen as complementary and cumulative. That means that they mutually reinforce, undergird, and also nuance each other. It is even possible to see some overlap between both. The first cluster is the inspiration and wisdom drawn from the liturgical movement. In particular, its conviction that it is not only possible, but also very enriching to construe a theology based on the lex orandi, or liturgy of the Church. The second cluster is the enormous legacy of the Second Vatican Council, which is not primarily something of the past, but rather something for the future. I will subsequently discuss each of these two clusters. They both consist of 4 dimensions. 2 times 4 is 8. 8 is a number which in Christian symbolism refers to the idea of renewal through the redemption of creation. The 7 days of God's creative activity and Sabbath rest are complemented by the 8th day of renewing everything. 8 means the recapitulation of the entire universe, including all future, present, and past generations of its inhabitants, to make it pass through the gates opened by the resurrection, and thereby bring it to completion. The ultimate goal of ecumenism is also to make the militant and peregrinating church pass through those gates and to present to God an unblemished offer. However, before I enter too much into eschatological speculations, let me refocus the attention on earthly hermeneutics and human finitude. Notwithstanding this jolt towards normality, it is not without meaning that in a time which has become addicted to the practical, the available, and the immediate, and which cannot but see opportunism and strategy everywhere, we wrote Sorores in Spain not only for concrete purposes, but also in view of a bigger picture. The contours of that picture are not yet lucid, but neither are they limiting. From within, we kept kept an eye on the beyond. We were aware that what we were doing may be both timely and, strangely enough, but healthily, unzeitgemäß. But let me now start with this first cluster, which is the wisdom from the liturgical movement. From the beginning of our work as a group, liturgy, thickly understood, that is, not as a mere series of ceremonies guided by the rubrics.
Okay, guys, this is the very heartbeat, for those who have been able to follow along, this is the very, very heartbeat of where the church is actually at and where the church is actually going. So I just want to say this for those who are looking for some other like new insights, reflections, points of just interest that go beyond kind of some of the general stuff you'll see in these discussions around Anglican Holy Orders. This is the heartbeat of it right here. It has to do with the liturgy and it has to do with eschatology. And I love this image he's going to use. He's going to use an image of a swimming pool where he's like, people felt like they've always been confined to swimming in the swimming pool, but then they open their eyeballs and they realize there's a whole lake they can swim in. And it takes them outside. It's the same image I always use from Joseph, King of Dreams, where it's like you see with your eyeballs, you see the cloud, but then eventually you realize there's a whole sky beyond the cloud that you can, right, like fly through. And anyways, it's a very profound image. And I think if you listen carefully to what he says, you'll see so many similarities with certain things that I try to say on this channel over and over and over again. And I hope this gives some more clout to it, that it's not something I came up with or something. I'm just trying to use this small platform God's given me to try and boost this type of thinking that actually occurs in the serious levels of theological dialogue in the church. This is a very serious man dialoguing, as was Dr. Jamie Hockey and Reverend Dr. Jamie Hockey. And so this is where the church is actually at in real life. This is why when when Pope Leo wrote to Archbishop Sarah Mullally, he talks about archic in this small little thing he writes. Like archic and what goes on in these discussions is extremely illuminating and serious at like real levels in the church, but oftentimes they're completely unknown to the wider ecclesial world. And so my hope is to bring some of these very interesting reflections into this world. But again, this one I'd say is the very heartbeat of it. It's about eschatology and it's about the liturgy, and how that is really the key to Christian unity, is eschatology and the liturgy, which also has to do with sacramental unity. Okay, I'll go ahead and keep playing this.
But as a genuine celebration of God's saving work has been on the horizon of our work. It was not always there as a topic, but it shaped our thinking and our praying together. Put differently, liturgy was not the bricks and timber we fabricated our house with, but the very soil on which we built it. Moreover, as is only logical today, we took care of an environmental-friendly construction and an appealing, generous architecture in concordance with the landscape and the climate. We hope that our work will be appreciated as not alienating, let alone polluting, its source. The liturgy as a source. Fons, where do we know that from? In any case, the 20th century liturgical movement has constituted for us a major source of inspiration, both theologically and methodologically. Not only what it achieved was inspiring to us, maybe even more so, the ways in which it operated. First, the liturgical movement developed a distinctive way of theologizing. It substantially contributed to the awareness that theology is so much more than a scholarly commentary on the authoritative faith formulations of the Church. Theology is not to be reduced to dogmatic and Dogmengeschichte, no matter how insightful they are and continue to be. Theology is not the art of proving that Christians are right about God's existence, and that the doctrines held by the Church make sense as a consequence of the fact that she has consistently followed in the footsteps of the apostles. By doing theology herself, that is, not only by reflecting about it from a distance, the liturgical movement showed that the lex orandi of the Church, the inexhaustible treasure of its liturgical prayer, is directive of what it thinks and how it thinks. Liturgy is not extrinsic to the faith. It is not the case that there is first faith content independently, and then a ritual or prayerful expression of it. Liturgy shapes the faith. It is not a mere product or result of it.
Okay, guys, so just real quick, this is where I say I actually got this line from him. When I really wrestled with this, I went, that is unimaginably profound. Theology doesn't come before the liturgy. It's not like you figure out all your doctrines and then you shape a liturgy to fit those doctrines. You actually first have the liturgy, which is Jure Divino, and I've argued that elsewhere. Soon I'll do a live stream again going over the typology of the Mass, because I think the more I think on it, the more profound it actually becomes to me. But the liturgy is Jure Divino. This is why the liturgy has the essential same structure. The Roman Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Divine Liturgies, the Anglican liturgies, the Lutheran liturgies, they all have the same core Jure Divino structure, which I could get into. The sevenfold structure is the call, the penitence, the praise, the word, the homily, the oblation, the sacrifice, and the communion. That's the Jure Divino reality, the sevenfold pattern of the Mass. But then from there, it's that liturgical reality, because the liturgical reality it's not just a pretty way of doing church to remember God. What it is it's bringing heaven to earth. It's the eternal it's the eschaton coming into the present for us to draw us into the eschaton. So this is where we get the notion that the cross, it's the once for all representation of Christ on the cross. It's also the eschatological banquet, the marriage supper of the Lamb. It's both at the same time, present on each and every altar. So what that is the Mass is one, and so it's the eschaton and the cross, both of those realities being brought into the present, and it draws us into a greater reality. So it draws us up with God, and it also draws us horizontally, because all people who have ever celebrated the Mass, it's all one. So it's a unifying ontological reality, and also a reality that unites us with the Father, right? Unites us with God directly, with the triune God. And so this is what he's talking about. Liturgy actually dictates what our theology is. It's not we do doctrine and then comes liturgy. It's liturgy is Jure Divino, and then theology we reason from the liturgy and from various places. And this fits beautifully, by the way, with Anglican theology, that it's, we believe as we pray. This is also true about Roman Catholicism. It's just a genuine apostolic Christian practice. So, all right, I'm not digressing, but I know I'm going off here. But hopefully that's a helpful point of reflection.
Worship is not simply doctrine performed ritually. The liturgical movement has, so far, not been able to make undone the consequences of extrinsicist and expressivist views on liturgy, treating it always as a graspable and controllable thing. But it has shown a way, promising way, out of many deadlocks. Our text is situated in the wake of the liturgical movement's strong ontological and theological claims about liturgy. Second, the liturgical movement developed a model of ressourcement before that notion became associated with an innovative way of doing theology, nouvelle theology, around the middle of the 20th century. There are reasons to assume that what the leading examples of the Nouvelle Théologie movement, the ressourcement movement in French theological circles, accomplished was somehow anticipated by the liturgical movement. Its representatives too went back to the sources, full of expectations, openly, inquisitively, and self-confidently. They somehow jumped from contemporary concerns right into the depths and riches of ancient Christianity, and found there a lot of intriguing insights unspoiled by post-Tridentine Thomisms and scholasticisms. Scholars and pastors associated with the liturgical movement hardly hid their amazement and contentment when they ventured to liberate themselves from conceptual rigidity. They had been trained to swim back and forth fixed distances in a swimming pool, but all of a sudden they discovered a lake. They had been told that swimming pools were the only places where to swim safely, but they found out that they could perform well in the open air too. Thoroughly versed in philology, classical languages, historical criticism, capable of doing rigorous conceptual analyses, Nouvelle theologians and key figures of the liturgical movement rediscovered solid building stones of the Christian tradition, the richness of which they had hardly suspected. They thereupon developed models of thinking and research which subsequent generations did not have to imitate, but could use freely and creatively. In this sense, we consider ourselves as standing on the shoulders of what Nouvelle theologians and scholars from the liturgical movement have accomplished. Third, as a concrete example of what this implies, one could refer to the...
I'm just going to say this real quick here. Again, I'm going to quote one of the great DreamWorks movies, this one time, The Prince of Egypt. If you know the song called Through Heaven's Eyes, when Moses goes into Midian and meets Jethro, and he says, he's basically saying, I have done nothing in my life worth honor. And Jethro says, of course you have. And then he starts singing the great song, Through Heaven's Eyes. One of the first lines is, and the stone that sits on the very top of the mountain's mighty face doesn't think it's more important than the stones that formed the base. So this is a twofold reality. One, we have to realize that we are not standing on level ground. We're standing on the shoulders of these extraordinary saints, men and women of God, over many, many millennia, centuries, really millennia, that have been doing this extraordinary work. And we have the enormous privilege of standing on their shoulders, being able to build off of the work that they've already done to move forward towards God's eschatological vision for the church. So we need to recognize, for one, we don't stand on level ground, we stand on the shoulders. With that said, we still are given the baton right now to take this and move towards that eschatological principle. So we also can't be afraid to take what they've done and to not develop it so much to a degree where it's incomprehensible to the inner logic that has gone before. But we want to carry on that core reality, that core of the onion, to use the analogy I've often used, the core substance of what something means and is getting at. In this case, the sacerdotal realities of the priesthood and the realities that the Mass becomes present to us on the altar to draw us into an eschatological and heavenly reality. That core substance is there. And when we stand on the theological work that they've already done and we continue to think about this and try to take it to the next level, and then what that should mean for our communion and communion basically between our traditions, that should lead us to a form of koinonia, of a really deep-seated and theologically rich reality that we are drawn into oneness through that which is one, aka the Mass, and which is the liturgy. So that would be my 2 cents. I think that line from The Prince of Egypt is really poignant and beautiful.
Liturgical movement's unpacking of profound layers of meaning contained in the concept of sacrament. The Latin word sacramentum does not simply evoke 7 rituals that throughout the vicissitudes of contingent history have come to play a privileged role in Roman Catholicism. It also renders the Greek concept of mysterion, which is itself
the word I use all the
connected
time,
to the idea of God's
mysterion.
unfathomable counsels and their communication to humankind.
See where I get this language?
Mysterion is moreover connected to the idea that this communication is somehow set forth in history. Revelation and incarnation undeniably have a unique and singular dimension, but not to the extent that they are confined to one identifiable moment only. They are perpetuated in history, passed on, transmitted, especially in the Eucharist, where gratitude for God's magnalia or mirabilia is expressed and experienced. Along with this deep understanding of sacrament as mystery, and mysteries, and mystery interwoven with history, came a resistance to locating the core or the essence of a sacrament in one single moment or thing, although this had become customary in sacramental theology, canon law, and ecclesial teaching. Sorores in Spe wholeheartedly embraces a mystery-filled theology of sacraments and sacramentality. In doing that, we deliberately move away from patterns of thinking which try to establish the certainty of faith on the foundations of an absolute control over material or formulaic details. Instead of focusing on one causa causing one effect and on one signum signifying one res, we have confidence in a multiple, multivarious, and symbolic approach to the sacraments, what they mean and what they bring about. Fourth,
I'm going to stop it just for a second here. Okay, so here you see a difference. The type of theology he's espousing here is what's espoused by the Resource Ma movement in large part, as opposed to Neo-Thomism. You notice he just used language like the res and the mysterion and these words that I use all the time. It's because it helps it helps us understand what's really going on. Like, what is the whole point of these realities that we participate in when we participate in the liturgy and in the Eucharist and these things? It's leading us to a greater oneness, a greater eschatological reality, which is the res, or the thing that it's drawing us into, the mysterion, the great mystery. And so, but one thing I just want to point out, I don't think that what he's saying negates that there's an importance still to the traditional categories of what a sacrament is, that it has proper intention, form, matter, and minister. Okay, it's not negating that there's something to that, of course. But what he's saying here now, he's using very high level language. That, you know what I mean, that it intuits. Obviously, you can see this is somebody who spends his life thinking about the liturgy. But what he's saying is that even though that's really important, there's a greater reality that those things are pointing to, that this document is trying to reflect on. Does the Anglican world, does Anglicanism, does it carry on the character of what that sacramental reality was always pointing towards, which is this like participation in the greater mystery, which draws us into the one. And so it's saying if the Anglican Mass basically is giving off this same reflection that is given off there, that of itself speaks to it's a more holistic way of looking at sacramentality. Okay, so it's not negating the need for, so don't misunderstand me. It's not negating the need for the importance of the traditional categories, which I too would hold, of form, minister, matter, and intent. But it's saying that there's more than just that, there's more than that. That's pointing to a greater reality. And if we observe the greater reality going on in a particular communion for 500 years, that says something to the continuation of that sacramental reality over these many hundreds of years. That's sort of what he's talking about here. I'm trying to paraphrase it in a way that I hope can be helpful.
The liturgical movement was also famous for its dealings with active participation, of course. Much more important for us than some of its interpretations along the lines of liturgical activism is the reality that liturgy indeed is an encompassing action people are invited to participate in, with their bodies and their minds, with their will, imagination, passions, intellect, and desires. That is, with their entire existence as whole persons. Active participation is unthinkable without an integrative and holistic anthropology. The latter should even promote the former and vice versa. Active participation is equally unthinkable without a participatory action. In line with what I have said already, the quality of that action is not surprising. It is the work of salvation as concentrated in the Paschal mystery, with its universal significance and its singular connection to Jesus Christ. Sorores in Spe is yet another voice in the choir singing the song of active participation. Its sound is theological. It does not play a false ideological note. The second cluster is the lasting legacy of the Second Vatican Council. Vatican II has been an unparalleled historic event. It was so much more than a gathering of responsible church people discussing contemporary concerns. It was not a business meeting with an agenda preparing future policy. In addition, it cannot be properly assessed and appreciated today according to the stereotypical opposing tendencies of continuity versus discontinuity with tradition. Vatican II itself is tradition. It is part of the long chain of ecclesial gatherings through which something of God's will is passed on to humanity. Correspondingly, we have worked with Vatican II as a point of reference, not primarily because of the beautiful texts it produced, but because of its being a theological event of sorts. In a way, even if this makes not much sense from a purely chronological point of view, Vatican II was for us maybe the source to which to turn in a true resource mode. Itself calling for an aggiornamento through ressourcement, the three words matter, aggiornamento through ressourcement, it delivered us fresh and living water, so dearly desired by deer. And hopefully we won't become a hunted game ourselves. However, to the extent that by drinking and showing where we drunk, we naturally let our guard down, let us hope that our vulnerability will turn out to be our strength. First, Vatican II emphasized a dynamic understanding of revelation.
Let us hope that our vulnerability will ultimately, in the end, be our strength. That is a profound comment. And I couldn't agree with that more. I would just note the similarity or how that reflects the reality that those who try to hold on to their life will lose it. But those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the kingdom of God will find it. And this is true for individuals. This is also true, in a sense, ecclesial realities. Churches also need to be willing to walk the way of the cross, because it's through the cross that resurrection comes. And so unless a single grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains a single seed. But if it dies, then it can bear much fruit. It's the same principle. Now, dying doesn't mean losing all of your identity or losing your ecclesiality or losing all the importance of things that God has shown you and that you should hold on to over the years. But what it's saying is sometimes we need to continuously be brought into the light to recognize that certain times we have to beat swords into plowshares in order to go towards something greater. And that's what they're trying to draw on here. Since Vatican II, that's been where things have changed. And so obviously there's lots of criticism within the Roman Catholic Church towards that mindset. There's lots of criticism within Anglicanism towards any sort of ecumenical mindset. But ecumenism makes you vulnerable, but it also in the end becomes your strength, because it is a sense of beating swords into plowshares so that new life can come forward and new creation can be brought about through the midst of our bodies in the way that God wills. So, all right, I'm going to go keep playing this.
Revelation is more about the act of revealing revelatio than about the promulgation of revealed things, revelata.
Really stop it.
It is God's self-communication in such a way that human beings can grasp it, not fully, but sufficiently and always provisionally. It is not that one can see everything once the bride's veil is lifted, but it is enough to seal a mystery of love and fidelity. Revelation, moreover, is all about the subtlety of transparency, which helps one remove any obstacles caused by obscurity or worse, obscurantism.
Sorry about these sounds,
Christ's
guys.
light doesn't tolerate hiddenness. Revelation shows light in dark places. It assists, supports, and accompanies when a way out must be found. God's revelation is there not for its own sake, but for the liberation of people from different kinds of enslavement. Revelation saves, redeems, emancipates, enlightens, manifests, clarifies, indicates, educates, etc. This outstandingly verbal instead of substantive understanding of revelation, along with its underlying communicative, dialogical, and dynamic theology, replacing a substantialist or essentialist metaphysics, was a great source of inspiration for us. Second, and similarly, Vatican II's ecclesiology helped us immensely in finding a theological language adapted to different layers or spheres of ecclesiality. There has been a time in Roman Catholicism when it was almost natural to understand the reality of the Church as constituted solely by a specific class of people ministering in it. This ministering of the ordained clergy was paired with administration and an administrative mentality that permeated the deepest fibers of the church fabric. The church resembled a factory managed by professionals, interested above all in the growth of the company and the maximization of profit at the expense of its competitors. As a condition for this, a strict control over the production process, as well as the employees on the payroll, their education and their profile was a necessity. There wasn't too much room for continuous formation, let alone for creating a safer work environment and a more pleasant atmosphere on the floor. Diversity, if at all allowed, was mistrusted rather than embraced. Pluralism was a threat instead of an opportunity. In sum, it seemed as if the economy of salvation was taken over by single-issued officials. The church offered services, but did not really serve. Or in the language of the liturgy, it offered services, but did not really celebrate. There was a mass production, but not a Eucharistic enthusiasm. Fortunately, Vatican II helped clear the way so that a veritable enthusiasm for the Eucharist could be found again. This created options for considering important themes, including consecration, communion, community, unity, harmony, real presence, grace, etc., with fresh eyes. The attention Vatican II had for the Eucharistic ecclesiology was an important motivation for our drafting Sorores in Spe. Third, and more specifically, this was the case particularly for some thoughts about Christ's triplex munus. Christ's being and acting as priest, prophet, and king greatly shapes the theological imagination when it reflects on important issues and wants to structure variegating ideas. Sharing in Christ's threefold office turned out to be a particularly powerful pattern when we try to think about the relationship between common priesthood and ministerial priesthood. The differences between these two do not run parallel with the distinction between laity and clergy. And baptismal priesthood is always already sacramental, royal, and prophetic.
Mm-hmm. I just want to say real quickly, so he's dropping some knowledge bombs right now, guys. But partially, what we have to understand, when you read Unitatis Sui Integratio, and this is just true about the theology of the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church in general, baptism and mutual recognition of baptism is not like a small thing. Mutual recognition of baptism is an enormous, unequivocally massive thing, because it is through baptism that we are united to Christ's body and the church, and that we're oriented towards salvation. And so much of the theology of Vatican II, and then also ecumenical theology, is built off of one baptism together, and then how are we living out that baptism. But even when the church is spoken of, it's spoken of as it's those who are baptized. So for example, in the Synod and Synodality, when they would ask questions so they'd put out questions all around the world where people could come and give their reflections on them. It was not saying, okay, all Roman Catholic people come and give your reflections. The exact language they used is all the baptized can come and give their reflections. And actually, this is why in the modern Synod and Synodality, there were all sorts of representatives from different Christian bodies, such as the Anglicans, who were present at the Synod and Synodality and gave a voice to kind of conciliarism within the church. And so I just want to say this is a major factor. So I will just note too, just as a funny aside, if you look at who the Church of England sent to the Synod and Synodality, they sent the Bishop of Chichester, who is the last, one of the two last diocesan bishops in the Church of England, who is a male-only Holy Orders guy. So whenever the Anglicans meet with Rome, they usually send their very best, most Catholic people. At least some of them. There's other very Catholic bishops, but oftentimes they're flying bishops in the Church of England. But of the diocesans, the Bishop of Chichester, I believe it's Bishop Warner. I could be getting that wrong. But anyways, the Bishop of Chichester was one of the Anglican representatives. Pretty fascinating. All right, I'm going to keep going.
Moreover, priesthood is both presbyteral and sacerdotal, and it is not just by becoming a priest that one shares in the church's priesthood. Sharing in priesthood and priesthood as something to share became important focuses of our ideas. We accordingly deepened ideas on deacons and bishops as well, about the pastoral nature of all kinds of priesthood, and about the many and divergent ways this reality is lived, explained, and experienced, not only by ordained priests, but also by other members of Christ's body. Fourth, the Second Vatican Council gave rise, of course, to one of the most comprehensive liturgical reforms in the history of the Church. It comprised not only a revision of the books, the rubrics, the prayers, and the texts, but a reconsideration of the whole sacramental infrastructure of the Church. It was neither window dressing nor the building of a new construction. Both the foundations and the facade were tackled. It was in fact a major remodeling of the entire palace, including the gardens. With respect to the reforms of the rites of ordination, this specific room in that palace was even done twice, and twice thoroughly, actually. The first time already in 1968, the second time in 1991. The revision of the liturgical books incisively affected the Church's self-understanding. It profiled the role and the meaning of the bishop as well as that of the gathering assembly. It was no longer focused on handing over symbols of power, but on entrusting chosen people with a special mission. There came an accent on sharing, giving, and testifying.
You see conciliarism and authority coming together.
And so much more greatly inspired us when we were writing Sorores in Spain. Thank you for your attention.
He's a legend. I'm going to play a little bit, guys, here. They do a little bit of Q&A. I want to play a little bit of this.
Presented to us what I would call the backstage of the Malines Conversation Group, so the way you work at the level of methodology, but also for pointing out some very important critical points that certainly will raise some discussion. And thank you for a very imaginative speech. I'm sure that some of the images you have used about the transparency of revelation, eschatology of the ecumenical movement, and so on will remain with us. And also, I would say, as a Centro Pro Unione, mentioning Vatican II as an event, as a very special meaning. So now we had access to the document.
Some of these questions and answers
originally 15 minutes of discussion. I would say perhaps a little bit less than 15 minutes. I would suggest we can start thinking about 8 minutes, which we have learned it's a symbolic number, extremely rich. So let's open up our discussion. And for the moment, we just take quick remarks or quick questions. We will have later on more time for the discussion. So please, if you have questions or remarks, to the speakers. And please, of course, the invitation is also for those who are following online. And let me say, the spirit of this day is really to be a study day. So every single contribution and idea is really warmly welcome because it's a laboratory in a sense. So we just have to put together ideas, questions, and difficulties perhaps also.
My name is Father Jim Puglisi, so maybe I can start by posing a first question. I found both of the presentations really fascinating, and after having read and studied the text that you presented, think that An important dimension that you bring forward is the ecclesiological one. And this ecclesiological one has to be seen, however, in a different context today. I will speak more this afternoon about that when I talk about sacramental ecclesiological reflections, which takes us out of the question of dogma, canon law, and beyond to what Joris spoke about, the mysterious aspect of the church.
So we're going to talk about canon law here.
So I would be very interested in knowing how you would articulate ecclesiological approach that you would use in this document. You spoke very little about canon law whatsoever, which is not a bad thing. But however, if canon law is taken as positivistic law, then it is a bad thing. But if we take canon law as a theological reality, then we're looking at something different. So how did you deal with that aspect? Because obviously the papal bull has a canonical importance for us. So maybe either Jamie or
this is really important how they respond here.
That question. Thank you, Jim, very much. You're absolutely right. There's almost nothing, in fact, possibly nothing at all, explicitly about a canonical perspective in the document. I think how the sort of vision we've tried to articulate relates to issues of canonicity is fundamentally concerned with the sort of mentality shift that this document is arguing for. It really is a sort of a shift in theological mentality. And
as a communion theology, a hermeneutic of unity,
a response to the gospel, if the canon law is actually sort of shaped by the church's living of the Paschal mystery, I suggest that canonical perspectives, whilst on one level needing integration, may also need challenge by, as it were, the primary theology, which is the grace, the mysterion of the Paschal mystery. So I think
canon law is important,
were I to be asked how canon law might respond to this document, there are two answers. The first is it could simply condemn this document, straightforwardly condemn it. The second is that canon law itself, in both our communions, by the way, canon law itself in both our communions, can accept the challenge from the kind of theologia prima, which this document is trying to argue for. Joris, is that fair? That was yes.
Well, I wanted to begin on that last observation that canon law is in a way secondary, and we focused our attention on the primary. That we're not against canon law, of course, and we hope that canon lawyers can develop canon law that accommodates what we've tried to do, and that's how it, in a way, always happened in history. And a positivistic and a very rigid kind of canon law will not help us. And very strict divisions between supernatural and natural and so forth, that will not be of any help.
That's really interesting.
Because you raised both the question of
I just
method
want to say this real
and
quick.
the mentality shift.
I mean this respectfully, but a lot of Roman Catholics online, I see some degree of wrestling with separating canon law versus the theologia prima. That there's Anglicans do the same thing. This whole thing recently, I won't get into this right now, but between the different jurisdictions of Anglicanism in the United States, there's a canon law perspective. And usually when we speak of, are we in communion with this group, we're speaking from the level of canon law. But there's a more primary theological overarching reality, which is that of the mysterion, of the res, the reality, the oneness of the mass. The fact that we are drawn in through anamnesis, we're drawn into the sacrifice of Christ on the cross and the eschaton in the mass. That there's a theological, ontological unity that comes through baptism and then through the other sacraments of the church, such as the Eucharist. Well, primarily baptism and the Eucharist, but all the seven sacraments can draw us into into this breadth of the Catholic Church. But, well, I'd say the main place that happens is in baptism and the Eucharist. And then, in confirmation, then in the one Spirit. But so there's this overarching principle. And that's where I think we need to reflect. Canon law is important. So what the canons of the church say, or who our churches say in this current moment in time that we're in like jurisdictional unity with, those things matter. But there's still a greater overarching reality of there's one mysterion, and the overarching question is, do people participate in this? And sometimes that's left in mystery when it comes to certain groups, but there's still an overarching theological reality, and that's what this document's based around. And so, again, when you're speaking of like Anglicans specifically, and I think he'll go on to talk about here, the next question they're going to ask is, are Anglicans in a different position with Rome than other reformational Christian groups? And what they're going to say is, yes, absolutely. And so partially that's because our liturgical realities, which come down through our apostolic succession, put us in a very different place than other reformational groups that don't carry that same liturgical heritage and the heritage of apostolic succession. So this is very important. Again, it's very similar to what Anglicans are getting at with branch theory and a sacramental view of the church. All right, I'll go ahead and keep playing this.
Document, which I think is really the reach of the document. When we deal with ecumenical methodologies, the questions behind is always to what extent can they be reproduced in other bilateral dialogues or in other groups?
This is what she's talking about.
Because in a certain sense, we look for patterns that could be used in other situations, but on the other hand, we also know that each bilateral dialogue as a story and a method of its own, and the context, and each. So
she's saying here, like Roman Catholic Presbyterian versus Roman Catholic
Anglican. Each document
Anglican.
has its own method.
There can be some overlap.
Sometimes, for example, when we deal with receptive ecumenism or differentiated consensus, now you know that there is this raising interest whether differentiated consensus can be applied to Pentecostal Catholic dialogue, for example, which is yes and no, because it's so different from all the other dialogues that have used differentiated consensus that it's really a question. So my curiosity is, do you expect your methodology also to be applicable to other contexts, or was it really very much linked to the context of the Malines Conversation Group and the Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue? But as I said, I'm sure that also Professor Hen will give us more insight later on, maybe on the hermeneutical approaches in a wider sense. But I don't know if you have already a quick answer to this question. Thank you.
I think what we've done is very contextual. It certainly has to do with the very rich history of family likenesses between Anglicans and Roman Catholics. And maybe the water is a little deeper in other ecumenical dialogues that we're involved in. So I think that what we have been able to come up with is certainly to a large extent dependent on a deep familiarity and friendship. Another spontaneous reflection that I have is that I don't think that what we've done is already mature enough to label it. We don't have a label of like receptive ecumenism, the consensus, and
eschatological epistemology.
We don't have that, and maybe we don't need it.
I think what Joris has just said is profoundly true. The document is shaped in part by years of work with a group of close theological friends, Anglicans and Catholics, working intensely on these kind of conversations. So it has an accent and a grammar which I think is distinctive. That said, and I would bow to Professor Hen's expertise on this, but it strikes me at least that this is faithful to the kind of theological dynamic which is present in the 3 rounds of Archic so far. This is not off track from that. It's reliant on it in some ways. It is implicitly, I think, reliant in some ways on the broad concept of receptive ecumenism, although it doesn't draw on it explicitly. But I think it's a faithful, as it were, further iteration of the kind of language, the kind of theological concepts that Archic has used in the past and is continuing to deploy now But yes, I mean, this is a young document. It will, as ever, be dependent on reception and critique for the sake of the church in the world. And I think I would want to underline those final words, the church in the world. This is fundamentally important because of God's promise of salvation for the world.
Profound. All right, cool. Well, I pray that was edifying, guys. I really believe that is, and by the way, again, so if you want to listen to it more coherently, and obviously the actual video will be better if you just watch it on your own, because it's choppy when I'm doing it on here because my internet's struggling. My wife's computer is struggling to hold all this stuff. It can be coherent. The description of that video is in the link here. And by the way, those are lectures 1 and 2. There's actually 8 lectures that were done at this conference. So you can watch. There's 3 other videos like this where different scholars come on and talk. These are my favorite ones. They're the first and the second ones as they have listed. But I pray this is edifying for you guys. It definitely, again, it's in a sense, it's mental massaging to think about these questions in a different way. It's not that the historical questions don't matter, because they do, but those historical questions are drawn into a larger question, which is really about God's eschatological will for the church. And where has all the great theological dialogue that's occurred since the time of the Reformation, really, but it culminates in something like Vatican II. Well, it culminates in the Anglican side. The Oxford movement then kind of leads to Vatican II and the Resource Ma movement. Not 1-to-1, but they're both kind of going on. And then from there, that great ecumenical movement that comes afterwards into the modern day. There's enormous movement that's occurred here. Again, it's not happening on its own. It's built off earlier things that have happened. But it's really profound stuff. And so it's getting us to think in a different way than just the old categories. We're bringing the old categories into dialogue with the new. And in some ways, the old categories do have a reflection. They're not, they're a little distinct from canon law, but they kind of have that, they have a different form of reflection, whereas the newer has more of an overarching reflection on, again, on eschatology. I know I keep saying that because that's what it is, but it's about what is God trying to do in the midst of all of this stuff that's happened in church history to draw us towards where his actual will is, and what has he showed and revealed to us. And a lot of this has to do with this like convergence of conciliarism and authority, and other points of convergence that have happened since the time of Vatican II. So that's what they're saying. It's built off of the work that was done in Archic, which is not done on an island. It's obviously done in a much larger conversation with the Resource Ma movement, with the Oxford movement, going back in time to the earlier periods in Anglicanism and different periods of thought in Roman Catholicism. And obviously, it's also drawing back to the patristic era and kind of some of the way that Saint Augustine would parse out how signs and then the reality relate. So the sign is really important, but the sign is always meant to point to the res, which is the ultimate reality, or the mysterion. That's an Augustinian principle. So anyways, you see all these things kind of come crashing together, and they're all very, very pertinent when it comes to these questions. If you want to go a little deeper on this document in particular, a long time ago, I put out a video called, I put out multiple things on Anglican Holy Orders, but I think it was the first one I put out. So it was months ago. And I actually walked through the Malines Conversation document pretty in depth. I put the words on the screen and I worked through various parts of the document itself. So if you're interested, you can check that out. But yeah, if you have any trouble finding it, let me know in the comments, in the normal video comment section, and I'm happy to post that there. But yeah, again, I pray this is edifying, guys. If you do have any comments, questions, reflections before I wrap up the stream, go ahead and drop them in the chat now, and I'm happy to interact for a little bit. But other than that, yeah, I just pray this was edifying, guys. I find this lecture fascinating. I would encourage anybody, if it was too choppy, go back, and I'd encourage people to go back and really listen to it thoroughly. It is enormously profound. I've listened to this lecture many, many times, and so I'm excited to get to kind of work through it and share some of my reflections on it with you guys. So cool. Well, if I don't see any comments popping up here in the chat, I hope you guys have a blessed night. I'll hang on like 2 minutes to just interact with anything. But yeah, I hope you guys have had a happy feast day of St. Augustine to everyone. I'm here talking about talking about St. Augustine here, and his theology on his feast day. So a blessed belated feast of St. Monica to you guys, a blessed feast of St. Augustine. For those on the East Coast, I know it's now, or even in the Midwest, I know it's now the next day. So a blessed feast of the beheading of St. John the Baptist to you as well. But yeah, Quay, I totally agree. This is the heart of the matter today. Again, it's not eliminating the questions about history, but it's drawing those into the eschatological questions. And this is something, again, I'm feeling really drawn to push this point, because almost none of the conversation I see very little conversation online about eschatology and the liturgy. It's almost all about going back in history and talking about past history. And this is true not just about Anglican Holy Orders, but other questions. But again, all of these have to be drawn into the larger question, which is eschatology and where's God leading us. And if it is in fact true, which I would say Catholicism broadly, including Anglicanism, believes that the liturgy dictates our theology, then converging liturgies and the fact that both of our liturgies participate in the Jure Divino realities of the liturgy, which are derived directly from the Bible, from the book of Revelation and the entirety of the scriptures. I won't go into that right now, but has to do with the sevenfold pattern of the days of creation, the sevenfold pattern of salvation history, the seven churches in Revelation, the seven parts of the book of Revelation. They all tie in with the seven movements of the Mass. And then from there, if that is true, there's a oneness to that, which all of our communions then are seeking to participate in. And so that speaks to a wholeness that, again, like scholastic categories are drawn into that wholeness. So, and it doesn't solve everything, but hopefully it's interesting. So, oh, thank you for this kind comment. I appreciate you. I know it's a little, I know the video is a little and it's in and out, but I pray it was edifying and that the content's interesting. I really appreciate this. I really, really do believe that for those, again, there's different levels of like where people are at kind of in their journey of wrestling through these things. But for those who really, really want to get at the heart of like where our church communions are actually at on official levels, I would say this lecture, this two-part lecture we just reflected on together, is really, really a good reflection of where the church is actually at and how they actually think about things. And you see it reflected in like the language of people like Pope Leo XIV and the Anglican leaders. And you see it just reflected in so many ways. So I appreciate this a lot. Thank you. It really means a lot. So cool, guys. Well, and I guess I say this stuff a lot, but I guess I'll share one I've been reflecting on, because one of the, probably the next live stream I do will probably be on typology, because I really want to go really deep on what I was just talking about. I'll say this before we close out, unless anybody has any other comments, I'm happy to interact with them or questions or whatever. But when I talk about the sevenfold pattern, okay, what I mean is this is so interesting, guys. This is so, in my mind, this is like mind-blowingly interesting. The 7 days of creation, I realize it's 6 and then God rests on the 7th day. So the 7 days in Genesis. Now, again, I believe, we don't need to get into this right now, but I believe in an old earth. So I would draw those 7 days into the larger conversation with natural revelation and modern science. My point is the 7 days of creation, and those conversations are very interesting, by the way. But the 7 days of creation actually map 1-to-1 onto the 7 periods of salvation history that are laid out in the book of Revelation, specifically in the 7 churches of Revelation. So in Revelation, when Jesus speaks to the 7 churches, what he says to them is not random. He actually walks through 7 different epochs of salvation history. So, for example, the 7 churches in order are Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamum, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Those are the 7 churches. What he says to those churches in order lays out this particular pattern of salvation history. Movement number 1 is the Garden of Eden, which he talks about in the Church of Ephesus. Movement number 2 is the period of the patriarchs and then of Joseph. This he talks about at the Church of Smyrna. The 3rd church, Pergamum, deals with the period of the Exodus and the period of the wilderness wandering. The 4th period, and then they're crossing into the land. The 4th period of salvation history deals with the monarchical period and the time of the kings of Israel and Judah. The 5th period of salvation history deals with the time of the prophets, prior to the exile. The 6th period of salvation history deals with the post-exilic period, so with the period where they return from exile, and then you have like Eliakim and Nehemiah, and they rebuild the temple. And then the 7th period of salvation history deals with the New Testament and the coming of Christ and of the inauguration of new creation. Now, what's so fascinating is, again, those 7 movements map literally 1-to-1 onto the days of creation. So I'll just give one example that I've been really thinking about a lot. So the 3rd day of creation is when the land is drawn out of the water. Well, in Hebrew, if you saw, I made a short earlier today on this, by the way, but the in Hebrew thought, waters are chaos, and the land is where peace was. The land is where is again where God brings us to shalom, to peace. So waters are tumultuous, the land is peace. This is the typology of Noah's Ark. It's like the first ark in the Bible is actually the earth. The earth is a beautiful abode which is brought out of the chaos of the waters of creation. Okay, and then Noah's Ark is an abode in the midst of the tumult of the waters when God is reacting to the wickedness on the earth. But then ultimately they end up on land, right? And then, anyways, and then so in day number 3, you've got the land comes out of the waters. Well, what did I just say was the 3rd movement of salvation history as articulated at the Church of Pergamum in the book of Revelation? They go from it's the period of the Exodus. They go from the water, the Red Sea, to the land, the promised land. So they're drawn from the chaos of Egypt through the water, through, and then all the way to the land, which is the promised land. And this is, of course, a type for the Christian life. It's from baptism to new creation. But the point is, so like in the 3rd church at Pergamum, for example, it explicitly says, like, to he who conquers, I'll give him some of the hidden manna. It talks about the white stone. I'll write his name on a white stone. That's talking about the ephod of the high priest. It's like one of the 12 names of the 12 tribes of Israel. It uses the explicit language there. It explicitly talks about Balaam and Balak, which is obviously from the book of Numbers, where God blesses Israel. When Balak calls Balaam to curse Israel, he can do nothing but utter blessing. Anyways, you see this map on 1-to-1, the 7 days of creation with the 7 movements of salvation history. And you can do this with each and every day and each and every movement of salvation history. Now, what's also interesting, guys, is the book of Revelation itself also breaks into a pattern of 7. So the book of Revelation itself also has a 7-fold pattern. The 7-fold pattern of Revelation is the call of St. John, where Jesus says, John, turn around. That's the first movement. The second movement is the churches themselves, the 7 churches. The 3rd movement is when they worship around the throne of the Lamb, Revelation 4 and 5. The 4th movement is the opening of the 7 seals. The 5th movement is the blowing of the 7 trumpets. The 6th movement is the pouring out of the 7 bowls. And then the 7th movement is Revelation 21 and 22, when God walks again with man, the new heavens and the new earth. And so anyway, so this 7-fold pattern of the book of Revelation also maps on 1-to-1 with the 7 days of creation and with the 7 periods of salvation history I just talked about. So one example I like to give, I'll use the 2nd day as an example here. The 2nd day of creation in Genesis 1 is God separates the firmament above from the firmament below. Okay. The 2nd period of salvation history is the patriarchal period. Well, what happens in the period of the patriarchs? The true son of promise from the one who's not is separated. Now, God obviously still cares about the one who's not of promise. For example, Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael in Hebrew still means God hears. So God still cares for them. But there's no question that the promises of God come through the line of Isaac. There's a separation between Isaac and Ishmael, between Jacob and Esau, between Joseph and Judah, right? There's a separation. And so you see that in the patriarchal period. Then at the same time, in the 2nd church in the book of Revelation, which is Smyrna, it talks about those who are the true Jews from the false Jews. There's a separation. Okay. Then the 2nd movement in Revelation is the period of the 7 churches, which is all about repentance. It's largely about repentance and turning back to God. Well, repentance reorients us back to God. Okay. So anyways, you could see this 1-to-1 on every period. Like I said, it refracts out. The 1st day goes with the 1st movement, goes with the 1st section of Revelation, goes with the 1st church of Revelation. Okay. But then there's one other reality, and this is the salient point here. is the Mass itself, which earlier I argued was Jure Divino. And I've argued this, by the way, in the dialogue I did with Jonah Saller, Deacon Jonah. We talked about this. You can see it was like a 3-hour dialogue. We talked about it in the last hour. I also did a separate clip that says the Catholic view of the Book of Revelation. If you're interested in that I lay this stuff out there pretty deep, and Deacon Jonah and I go back and forth. He's wonderful, by the way. He's one of my favorite people on YouTube. I would definitely recommend his channel, Mere Catholicity. He's great, and even his newer stuff, as his thought is developed, his new stuff is so rich. I'm excited for him to put out new stuff. But anyways, so the sevenfold movement of the Mass, which again is held in common between Roman Catholicism, Anglicanism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Lutheranism, and other Protestant groups have they kind of reflect this, but this is where apostolic succession makes the big difference. But I won't go into that right now. But the main other bodies, the Oriental Orthodox, I'm sure as well, all of the liturgies in these traditions are the same sevenfold pattern. And this is the sevenfold pattern. It begins with an introit or a call. It has a penitential rite. It has a form of praise, like psalm readings, musical offerings. It has the readings of the Word of God. It has a homily, which explicates the Word. It then has the liturgy of the Eucharist, so the oblation or the anaphora, the anamnesis, the representation of the once for all sacrifice of Christ on the cross on the altar. So the oblation, and then the seventh movement is the communion, and this is where the priest who stands in persona Christi communes, and then the laity commune. Now, what's fascinating about this sevenfold pattern, which again is held across the breadth of the church, also lines up 1-to-1 with all the other patterns of seven that I've been laying out. So, for example, we could align the third movement of the Mass with the third church in Revelation, with the third section of Revelation, with the third movement of salvation history, and with the third day of creation from Genesis 1. Now, why does this all matter? We can do this with every single one. The reason that it matters is because what's going on then is it's saying that there's a oneness, a mysterion that is whole and one, and that when we participate in the Mass and the eschaton, we're participating in this great one reality that has refracted from the initial days of the creation of the cosmos all throughout the workings of God across space and time. It's all about they have integrity as their own moments, but they also are participating in a larger reality. So like the Exodus, for example, in the Old Testament really did happen. There really is an Exodus from slavery in Egypt. Obviously the Israelites at that time didn't realize, but they're really, in doing so, they're being drawn into a larger pattern, which is ultimately espoused in the Exodus from slavery to sin. And it draws us into that reality is drawn into this larger pattern that God is always using to just refract out the way that he works and how he brings about salvation throughout the entirety of the cosmos. And the more I ponder on this and think upon it, it makes so much sense and it's so profound. And that is, in my mind, what dialogues like this one we just watched in these two lectures in this document Sorores and Spey, that's what they're talking about when they're talking about the liturgy and the eschaton actually speaks to what goes on now and how it speaks to real realities that even transcend our ability to recognize them fully. So I hope that's interesting and gives us something to reflect on. By the way, just real quick, for those wondering how the Book of Revelation breaks down with the sevenfold pattern of the Mass. The first pattern of the Mass, again, is the introit, the call, where Jesus says to John, turn around. The second, so he turns, and by the way, he turns from liturgical east to liturgical west. That's also really important because liturgical east is the direction of the church of new creation. That's how water trickles out of the temple, and he turns around to liturgical west. Now, the reason that matters is because what points west is the tabernacle. And so basically he goes from the vision of living in new creation. Jesus says, John, turn around. And when he turns around, now he's facing west, which is the direction of the tent of meeting or of the tabernacle. And so basically he's standing at the entrance to the tabernacle throughout the book of Revelation, and God is opening up the Old Testament in front of his eyes. That's what's going on in Revelation, is he goes from looking at the new creation to turning around, and Jesus says, John, I'm going to explain to you what the Old Testament's always about. That's really what's going on, which is cool. So that's the first movement. The introit is akin to this when we're called into worship. Okay. Then the second point, the second movement of the Mass is the penitential rite. Well, the second movement of the book of Revelation is the 7 churches where they're called to penitence. So you see that there. The third movement of the Mass is the praise. Well, Revelation 4 and 5 is the worship around the throne of the Lamb. The fourth movement of the Mass is the Word of God, the reading of the Word of God. Well, that goes with the opening of the 7 seals, where the Word of God is open. But who's worthy to unlock the scroll? Well, it's only the Lamb who was slain. So it's through the lens of the crucified Lamb that we can actually see what the Old Testament was always about. So the 7 seals are unlocked. And by the way, there's writing on both sides. I believe it was St. Jerome who said one side represents the exegetical, like contextual meaning, and the other side represents the typological meaning or the Christological meaning of Scripture. So that's fascinating. But anyways, so the fourth movement is the reading of the Word of God, the opening of the 7 seals. The fifth movement is the homily. Well, what comes next in the book of Revelation is the 7 trumpets, the explication of the Word of God. Then the sixth movement of the Mass is the oblation, which goes with the pouring out of the 7 bowls. You see the language of Leviticus there, the pouring out of the blood. So that goes with the oblation or the sacrifice. So this would be the anaphora, right? And then the epiclesis, and it's the Eucharist, it's the liturgy of the Eucharist. Then comes the Revelation 21 and 22, where things are set right and God dwells with man again in the new heavens and the new earth completely, the way that it's supposed to be. And then this goes with, obviously, the communion of the priests and of the laity, where we are one with God. So where we are drawn into, oneness with God in the proper theological meaning of that. So do you see that? It's really profound. But again, it's something that's actually reflected all the way back from Genesis 1 and throughout the entirety of salvation history, throughout the whole book of Revelation, and then in the Mass itself. So last thing I'll say here, and then I'll wrap this up, guys. But my friend, I did a dialogue a while back. The audio was super scratchy and it was kind of wild. But with my friend, his name is Samuel, and on Twitter he goes by Blessed Absalom the Third. And anyways, he's a student at Nashotah House, and he was telling me this story about his, I believe she was Ethiopian Orthodox grandmother. And I believe in the Oriental Orthodox Church, if you ask them what the book of Revelation is about, they'll say it's about the liturgy. It's about the divine liturgy. That's what the Revelation is about, the Mass. And the more I think about that, the more I go, that's exactly what it's about. It's obviously about how God overthrows dominions and powers of the world and sets up an eternal kingdom that happens in large part through the Mass itself, because heaven comes to earth through that reality, and then we're drawn into that reality. So it's really beautiful stuff. One other just interesting thing I would note that the Mass also opens and closes with the sign of the cross and the invocation of the Trinity. The reason for that is because the Mass is inculcated within the life of the Trinity. So it begins and ends with the Trinity. Pope Francis talked about this at one point. The whole Mass is within the life of the Trinity. Therefore, again, that speaks more so to how it's an eschatological reality that when we participate in it, we're being drawn into communion with God. It's really profound. So, all right, guys. Well, I'll go ahead and stop there. It's really, hopefully, efficacious. I find it interesting. Thank you guys for joining in. I know it got super late. Again, a blessed feast of St. Augustine to you all, a blessed feast of the beheading of St. John the Baptist tomorrow. I'll go ahead and read a collect for us, and then we'll close from there. I'll read a collect for guidance. For ourselves and for the church. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, in you we live and move and have our being. We humbly pray you so to guide and govern us by your Holy Spirit, that in all the cares and occupations of our life we may not forget you, but may remember that we are ever walking in your sight, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. The Lord be with you. Appreciate you guys. Oh, thank you, brother. Appreciate you, man. Man, I'm so impressed you're able to catch these, man, living where you do. I know you live across the pond, but I really appreciate you, man. I pray this was edifying. Another channel to check out. Check out my man's channel, The Layman Apologist. Just put out a super fascinating video on the flood narrative and how does it relate to the other ancient Near East flood narratives. That's really fascinating stuff, by the way. I thought your video was super interesting. But again, some of the typology I touched on tonight actually speaks to some of what you put out too, brother. So appreciate you guys. God bless y'all. Hope you guys have a blessed night. We'll see you guys shortly. Take care. God's peace, y'all.